For this pod, I'm joined by the Athletic Seb Stafford-Bloor and also our Tottenham writer Jack Pitt-Brooke as well. So Spurs were beaten 3-2 yesterday in a North London derby. Seb, let's start with you. Were Spurs unlucky?
Yeah, at certain points. I think they probably didn't get the rub of the green with some of the officiating. I wouldn't say anything was particularly glaring, but ultimately, if you don't do the basics of the game well enough, if you don't defend properly at set pieces and you get punished, I don't think that is unlucky. I think that's just a kind of a failure to prepare.
We're looking at that sort of matchup between Davis and Saka. You'd probably think in Doggy versus Saka might have been a slightly different matchup.
I think so. I mean, I think I might have gone with Emerson Royale on the left just because obviously Saka's tendency and his trait is always to come out to in, off the right touchline in field, as he did so well for his goal. I think Royale is a slightly better defender in that kind of situation, obviously right-footed. So beyond the awkwardness of having that right foot on the left side, I think that provides a bit of cover for what is an exceptional case, a really, really exceptional player. And yeah, I think, and that's not to admonish Ben Davies for his performance. I thought there were definitely positives, and Ben Davies will always give you a really steady baseline. But his defending in those moments was not good enough, and the selection didn't look particularly great at what was a critical moment in the game.
Yeah, for sure. Jack, Ange Postecoglou praised Christian Romero. Says he's a World Cup winner, and I've just got to get some of what's in him into some of the other players. What do you think Romero brought to that match yesterday? Was it just his doggedness? Was it just his attitude? Or do you feel that it was that warrior kind of incentive that perhaps Postecoglou was thinking maybe some of the lads didn't step up to this North London derby?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is his refusal to lose and his determination to put his own body on the line. I think it's also probably his ability to make it up as he goes along. Even the goal that got Spurs back into the game at the start of the second half, that all came because Romero had effectively decided to play up front for a bit, and he intercepted David Raya's kick out and put it in the back of the net. And I think sometimes Tottenham, and a lot of teams like this, but they need players who are willing to go a little bit off script and to sort of play the situation rather than simply to kind of implement the manager's plans at all times. So I think maybe Tottenham do need people who can take the initiative like Romero did in that situation.
Yeah, Steb, you're nodding. You are happy Romero took the initiative, and it's probably what you need in a game like that, right?
I think especially so when you have some of the issues that Spurs do at the moment. Like when you watch them attack, it's as if when they get beyond 70 yards, the length of the grass changes. It's like they're playing in a foot of grass. Everything becomes so slow. There's so little movement at the top of the pitch. They look very, very easy to defend against. So when you have that unpredictable element, that's kind of necessary, like to sort of, to make you harder to defend against. And I think also Romero, I think he's due some credit because some of the things that Jack describes there, a year or two ago, they were very wild. Like some of what he brought was very much a kind of, really a double-edged sword. I feel that this season he's much more on the right side of that balance. The Chelsea incident, which kind of changed the season a little bit, I suppose it's a sliding doors moment. I felt it was pretty unlucky. The rules in the Premier League seem to change every single week now regarding that kind of tackle and what constitutes a penalty. So, it's pretty harsh to sort of to lay blame at his door for it. But yeah, I wouldn't criticize the attitude of many of the players. I think the term I'd use is probably bravery, like tactical and in the sense of expression. I think Romero brought something that, I don't know, a lot of the other Tottenham players seem to play between the lines on Sunday, which was pretty disappointing to see.
I don't think he's the only manager that would probably be saying that about his team. Arsenal, if you look at the game against Bayern Munich, those little details that cost them the match. Jack, if the manager's saying that, whose job is it to make those details rectified?
It's his job. It's completely his job. I think what's annoying to a lot of Spurs fans is that they had 2 weeks in between the Newcastle United game and the Arsenal game, and they showed exactly the same weaknesses in both games. If you take the two games together, Spurs dominated possession against Newcastle, they dominated possession against Arsenal, but across the two games they conceded 7 goals, 3 from corners and 3 from counter-attacks. And I know that, maybe in the real world, 2 weeks isn't actually enough to iron out these problems, and it does take longer. But from a fan's point of view, there's a lot of people out there thinking, well, what were they working on for those 2 weeks? Because they didn't really see much of an improvement in the two glaring areas that everybody knows Tottenham need to improve on. They're not good enough defending counters, and they're not good enough defending corners.
Yeah. Seb, is it a case of also just bringing in a set piece coach, for instance? Like, we've seen something like this employed in various teams. Obviously, the manager can do what he needs to do to get his team ready for the matches, but also perhaps there are extra components. And also, let's not forget, this is his first year, right? So there's still time to come.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the great ironies is that Spurs released probably the world's foremost set-piece coach when Postecoglou arrived, which is obviously a miss now. And he said to his defense, like he said, he doesn't necessarily want, I think, Jack will correct me if I'm wrong here, but he doesn't necessarily want an individual set-piece coach. He wants that duty to be shared by someone who has a responsibility which is broader. I think that's right. And that makes a degree of sense. The 1 year thing, what I'd say is never good to lose a derby. Really, obviously never good to be 3-0 down at half time on your own pitch in a derby. But there's a lot about Tottenham which makes you think if they were to add, for instance, the right type of forward at the top of the pitch or a couple of elements, you could see it moving forward pretty quickly. In the same way that you don't have to go back that far to a point where Arteta's Arsenal were objectively dreadful. They were a really, really stale side. They failed to create chances in the right way. They had that sort of very pedestrian sort of horseshoe shape around opposition boxes game after game after game. And, yes, it made them look like a poor team, but actually what they needed was just a few elements to kind of unlock the sort of the more potent aspects that they already did have. And I don't think the parallel is that literal between the two teams, but you could see Spurs being on a similar trajectory if they can cure some of these weaknesses. And what we're talking about, these are little minor things which kind of manifest in major ways at Premier League level. But they don't, this is not root and branch review territory. It's you tweak approaches, you add certain things, in the same way that you might add a spice to a dish, for instance. And then all of a sudden the result was a little bit better. And I think that's kind of the trajectory Spurs are on.
Yeah. And this then brings me really to where are we in this project, Jack? He's only done a year, right? And you look at Arteta's first season at Arsenal, obviously take the FA Cup win, but I mean, I think the team finished 8th. Is it hard to judge someone so early on what they've done? Because if Spurs end up finishing top 5 and qualifying for Europe, surely that's a really good start for someone to build on.
It is a really good start. Tottenham, I think at the start of the season, if you'd said Spurs would finish 5th with a points total, which will probably be mid-60s, maybe high 60s, people would have thought that was really good, particularly given it's the first season without Harry Kane. So I don't think that the frustration that a lot of fans are feeling at the moment should blind people to the fact this has been a good season, a really solid base. And as we said, this is kind of consistent. This is actually better than Arsenal's first year under Arteta, even Liverpool's first year under Klopp. So I don't think people should lose sight of that. But equally, there are very clear areas where the team has to improve if they're going to make the steps that Seb was pointing towards, from being a team whose aspiration is, not that Postecoglou would see it this way, but a team who's kind of around aiming for the 70-point mark, to a team with who wants to really compete with the big guys.
Yeah, Seb, how far do you think this team is from there in terms of the personnel you're currently seeing on the field to be in a point where they're competing, not necessarily winning, competing for that top 2, top 3 spot?
I think as a squad, still quite a long way. If you look at some of the teams who've really achieved across Europe this season, for instance, look at Bayer Leverkusen. So, they face a financial disadvantage against Bayern Munich, but I would argue that their progress and their title-winning season was kind of underpinned by flexibility within their squad, having players who can come in and instantly provide a contribution. I think there are some of those players at Spurs. I think there are some question marks about, for instance, Pierre-Emile Højbjerg's long-term future. Does Gio Lo Celso want to be a bench player, or can he go and play somewhere else? These types of issues. At the moment, I feel there's still that imbalance between starters and players who can come from the bench. Are there that many players also, for instance, who you would say can displace starters? I would argue probably not. I'd also say if Spurs are ever to be competitive at the level above, so where Arsenal currently are at the moment, you cannot have a situation where you lose one fullback or one wing back, and all of a sudden that drastically affects your ability to hurt an opponent or defend against them. And that's where the Spurs are, right? You lose Destiny, and all of a sudden it looks like a completely different side. Pedro Porro is the same, I would say. And there are options midfield, but I think also there needs to be a little bit more clarity there. Certainly needs to be a better range of options at centre forward. So I think they are still some way off kind of in terms of their rebuild, and there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of incoming players I think that would need to arrive at the club in the summer. I think the attitude is closer though. I think no one should lose sight of the fact that watching Tottenham play at the moment and the spectacle of a Spurs game in the eyes of a supporter, when you go to work, are you looking forward to watching the game that night? Yes, I think you are, which is something that wasn't the case a year ago, and it hasn't actually been true for a really long time. So, it's the different ways to answer that question. But I wouldn't say it's one of those situations where we're here now, let's all just sit on our hands and let things evolve and let the situation mature and we'll get there. I don't think that's the case. I still think it needs a bit of investment.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, if we're sort of looking at Spurs at this stage in time, also based on how they started the season, Jack, 26 of their 60 points came from their first 10 games. Also, they drew with Arsenal, those early games at the Emirates. They were top of the league after winning 8 and drawing 2 in those first 10 games as well. You can kind of understand where that frustration lies, but should we just take it in context as well? Like, it started brilliantly, but doesn't necessarily mean that's the way it's going to be all season.
Yeah, I think they kind of, in hindsight, maybe they were unfortunate they started that well, because I think maybe to some extent it kidded people that this would be a really simple process when really what they're trying to do is completely revamp the style of play, integrate half of a new team at the same time, which is, teams very rarely do, and live without Harry Kane. So I think because it had this great honeymoon period, I think people thought that the Spurs would be one of the best teams in the country all season, and clearly it hasn't been that way. I do think, if you flipped it, and if they'd started slowly and were now on a run of 8 wins and 2 draws from 10, which is how they started the season, then people would be saying, they've got all the momentum, they're going to be fantastic next season and all that stuff. So maybe they've been kind of victims of their own early success to an extent. And that means that the vibe at the moment is worse than the objective conditions.
I really, really agree with that, because I fell into that trap. I remember watching the first game against Brentford and being so happy about it, just thinking, goodness.
I think we did a pod on it at the early stage,
right.
and I remember the optimism, right? Yeah.
And I remember, I think I was lulled into this sense of security where I thought just every game is going to be this kind of exploration, and we're going to, everything's going to feature, like, I don't know, a new realization about how good Pap Sarr can be, and goodness, isn't Van der Ven quick? And I remember saying on another podcast, Van der Ven would have a really sharp learning curve. He would make some mistakes, they were buying quite a raw product. He came in and he looked absolutely fantastic. He looked like a kind of a quicker, stronger Jan Vertonghen. And I think that has created a really unfortunate context where everybody's a little bit more sour than they might otherwise be. And Jack made a great point earlier. These trends, these terrible results, you see them in every season that we've spoken about, like with sort of high-achieving Premier League managers. So obviously they were there for quite a long time with Arteta. They were definitely there with Jurgen Klopp. I remember a terrible defeat they suffered at Hull during his first season. I think it's the one where Tom Hiddleston cut his hair on the sideline when he grew it out for charity. Think of that game. It always happens. Guardiola at Leicester. I'm not saying that Spurs will ever rise to be at that kind of level, but I think it's easy to forget that this is one of those growing pains that you have to go through, even if it is just to demonstrate and identify what's wrong and what needs correcting in the summer. And clearly there's a lot of those things, but I don't think it should detract too much from the kind of the more general body of work.
I just looking ahead at their fixtures, Jack. I mean, Chelsea away, Liverpool, obviously you got Burnley, and then you've got the big one really now. Feels like Manchester City. You'd have thought Arsenal was the test. Manchester City, one to try and derail this team from yet again another Premier League title, but also from a Spurs perspective, where they're looking to end that season. That Manchester City game really does feel like a huge test.
Yeah, I really think the mood going into the summer will be much better if Spurs can get kind of one sort of statement-y win out of Chelsea, Liverpool and City. If they can win one of those games in an impressive way, I think that will really change the mood. But if they only win their games against Burnley and Sheffield United remaining, then they'll still have a decent points tally. But I think there will be a bit of talk of when was the last time Spurs played well going into the off season. I'm fairly bullish that they will get some good results in those games. I mean, Chelsea are incredibly inconsistent. Liverpool clearly have run out of steam, and even in the City game, obviously City are a fantastic team, but it's one of those things where I think because the narrative going into that game will be all about, do Spurs actually want to win, even if it means Arsenal winning the league? That's the kind of thing that really ruffles players' feathers, and that means that I think the Spurs players will actually be kind of doubly motivated for that game, because they'll want to they will want to prove that they do not just want to roll over. So I think and if they can win one of those three games, I don't think they're going to catch Aston Villa, but I do think that will change the mood going into the summer.
Yeah, Seb, do you buy that? You don't think Spurs will catch Aston Villa, but that City game could be really vital in terms of how the fans sort of gauge the tail end of the season as well.
Yeah, absolutely, because you need the headline. I think you need, anytime you win a game like that, I think you probably argue that winning at Stamford Bridge would be the biggest statement. Certainly it comes without the complications of potentially handing Arsenal a title. But yeah, I don't think catching Aston Villa is such an important thing, because whilst everyone would want to qualify for the Champions League, and as a fan I'm no different, I think in this squad's, at this period for this squad, it feels like the next step is probably the Europa League for them, and having the opportunity to play in a competition where you don't necessarily have to play your first 11 in every game. You create a kind of a more meritocratic culture whereby you can give some minutes to younger players and you can allow them to have that kind of platform between academy and first team. I think whilst not much of a spectacle, and it always involves games that, don't really capture the interest in quite the same way, I think it'd be incredibly valuable in the same way that it was right at the beginning of Pochettino's time at the club. You gave players the opportunity to stake a claim. I think Villa are more than deserving potentially of their Champions League place. I think they've been great at really, important moments. But it's interesting. It's a funny thing that Jack says, and he's absolutely right in that when people start talking about, we should lay down for Man City and make sure that, ship 7 goals, play the kids, make sure that, nothing untoward happens as a result. I feel like as a player, it kind of jabs you in the pride a little bit, right? You must want to retaliate, and you kind of you're sort of forced and compelled to overcompensate. And I can absolutely see it. And also, historically, Man City have been bafflingly bad against Tottenham so many times in the past. They just have this weakness that even Guardiola seems unable to cure on the counter-attack. And it's, even when Spurs don't get a win, it's weirdly close. Even, the game at the Etihad early in the season when, Spurs effectively had me and Jack playing centre half. Somehow they took a point from. It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Do you think, I think that's a very good point actually, whether Champions League or Europa League suit this current squad. But also, Jack, going into the summer, Europa League kind of affects, I guess, the players you buy really fundamentally, and moving ahead. There's no doubt that this squad needs a bit more depth, but does Europa League feel like a good sort of graduation coming into next season for Tottenham?
Yeah, I think in modern football, it doesn't matter as much as it used to what European competition you're in, because firstly, the financial strength of the Premier League means that we see this all the time now. Players leave teams who are playing Champions League football for clubs on the continent to come and play for English teams who are not in European competition, because the salaries are so good. So I think, and that allows English teams to really throw their weight around in the transfer market. And I don't think that will be any different this summer. The fact is, Tottenham signed some seriously good players last summer, even though they weren't in Europe at all then. They signed Maddison, Van der Ven, Vicario. They had a really, really good summer. And I think a lot of players do want to. They'll look at Postecoglou, his style of play, the kind of sense that Tottenham are heading in the right direction, which is another thing that players want to play for. They'll look at the stadium, the training ground, and the facilities. And I think that, they maybe there's an absolute top level of player who would not want to come and play for a team that isn't the Champions League, but the type of kind of aspirational, on their way up, early 20s players that Tottenham are targeting in the market, I think those guys wouldn't mind about doing 1 year outside of the Champions League to kind of get on the Tottenham bandwagon. So I don't think it's going to be a huge problem really going forward.
I'm just thinking about, if you compare it to sort of Arsenal, what the summer looks like for Tottenham, Seb, in terms of do people go? How many kind of players do you bring in that respect? Is Postecoglou ruthless and saying Richarlison might not take us any further? Do we keep Timo Werner on? Do you know what I mean? Like, what does that sort of makeup look like of that squad looking forward?
Well, it seems to me like in terms of Postecoglou, I mean, maybe Jack is a better place to answer this, but it seems like Postecoglou is now a voice within a committee, and Spurs' transfer activity is not just run by a single person at the top of the club anymore, which is hugely good news. I think the one area which is tricky, and I agree, Jack, I think that the old era of thinking, well, when you get to the Champions League, you can sign a different type of player. I don't really agree, because I think when players talked about wanting to play Champions League football, it was just code for I want to earn more money. And Spurs now offer the opportunity to do that. But clearly there's a lot to do. I think there needs to be cover in both fullback positions, probably an extra centre-half, unless Ashley Phillips is ready to come up and play at that level. Midfield, probably at least one extra wide forward and a centre forward. So you're talking of quite a lot of stuff even before you get to players perhaps wanting to go, players needing to go, money needing to be brought in. So there's a major amount of work that needs to be done, which demands a certain level of ruthlessness. You can't be any other way. And I think also sort of one of the problems that Postecoglou inherited was this squad which, when it did play in European competition outside of the Champions League, you saw the gap between the first team and everybody else. And that's a layer that's really difficult to fix. That, I still don't know there's a precise way of doing it, but it's a troubling situation. But yeah, you need to have. You can't just be loyal to players on the basis that they're already at the club. I think that's clear. So I don't think necessarily relates to Richarlison though, because I think there's clearly a utility to the way he plays the game, even if it's not always suited to particular fixtures.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. I just used him as an example, not because I don't like the player.
Yeah, no, I crack back against you. How dare you? How dare you pick him out?
Talk about our Brazilian international.
I do think Richarlison is a good example, because he's probably the most sellable player that Tottenham have.
That's what I was alluding to.
Who isn't a guaranteed starter. So it kind of depends on. So I do think that if hypothetically they could get, so they spent an initial £50 million on him in 2022. If they could get close to that money back, let's say from a team in Saudi Arabia, because I don't think it would be a team in Europe, then I can see them perhaps. I can see why under certain scenarios they might be tempted. And that's not to say, and I'm not saying that I think they will or should sell him, but I can see the argument for doing so. Whereas Tottenham don't have that many whereas the other players who in theory could command money in the transfer market are players that Tottenham would definitely want to keep hold of. So I mean, I think it's probably more likely than not that Richarlison will stay, but I can see, the other factor here is to what extent do Tottenham want to sell players to generate more money, or are they happier, keeping most of the squad in place and only making minor additions?
Well, that's the bigger one, isn't it? Because I'm looking at the Spurs squad, and you think about players like Højbjerg that no one's quite sure about what their future looks like, Seb. Those players could easily be moved on, you kind of imagine, or Spurs are in that weird precarious position where you go, actually, we haven't got that much depth in squad. Maybe they do suit something for another season at least.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, although I go back to the original point, which is I'm not convinced that Like I think Pierre Højbjerg is a perfectly good player. I just don't think he's suited to playing it for this team and for this head coach. And I feel beyond a certain point, it becomes a little bit unfair on him because he's asked to do things he's not comfortable doing, and that has shown time after time after time. And if you watch him, you can see that in his demeanor, and you can see him respond to the negativity which surrounds, like, misplaced passes and what have you. And so, like, useful or not, useful with a small u, I would say, and also only useful in very particular game states. So if you're defending a 2 or 3 goal lead away from home, Højbjerg's your guy, right? Because he can come in and block up a midfield. If you're chasing a game and you want him to be, and you want a player who can be expressive from the base of midfield, not your guy, actually more likely to make things worse. And I have that question for different reasons about a couple of guys. Basuma is, in the same way that Spurs started really, really well, I feel like I fell for Basuma a little bit too quickly because he has, I'm not sure it's an emotional issue, a physical issue, or just a general suitability issue because he hasn't been selected as continuously as he previously was, but not the same player, clearly. And those are the things that need to be addressed. And just saying, well, this player gives us cover. Well, it's the same cover that let Spurs down a little bit. Not the players, but the kind of the nature of it this season.
Yeah, then the bigger question is, Jack, how much money do Spurs have to spend? A quiet window to a certain degree. Dragusin and also Werner on loan. I know Dragusin was bought in. I mean, are Spurs looking at a splurge this summer if there might seem like that we're going to see some outgoings?
I don't think it will be a splurge, but I think it will. I think they've got more in the PSR era. Spurs have got more room for manoeuvre than other teams. The way I always look at it is that if you think of PSR as basically a road where there didn't used to be speed cameras and now you've got to drive at 30 miles an hour, for all the clubs that have been driving at 31, 32, they've got to put the brakes on. But if you've been kind of going at 25, 26, you're one of the few teams who can afford to accelerate. And so I think Tottenham, we saw that a bit. Yeah, we saw that a bit in January when Tottenham bought Dragusin and barely anyone else bought anyone. And I think that Tottenham will be. I'm sure they will be more active than some of the other big teams around them because they do have that PSR headroom. I expect them to also keep a very kind of eagle eye out on other teams who might need to sell for PSR reasons. It's well documented that they've been monitoring the Conor Gallagher situation at Chelsea. They've been curious, let's say, about the Jacob Ramsey situation at Aston Villa. And there are going to be some teams who do need to sell players ahead of the June deadline. And so let's wait and see how Tottenham operate in the start of the market.
Yeah, just thinking about what we were talking about, Romero at the top, Seb, in terms of the job that Ange Postecoglou's got ahead of him in trying to reshape a mindset of a team post Conte, post Mourinho, and also, how long he'll have to do that. Do you think, Dan Levy's seen enough here to think, okay, if this is my man, I will be able to give this guy more money to build what he needs to build to get us to where we need to get to? I think it's a 4-year contract he signed, isn't it?
Yeah, I would certainly think so. I mean, if your interest hasn't been piqued by what this guy might be able to do with a few more attacking players, then I don't know really what to tell you. Like, no one's denying any of the weaknesses. But if you were to say, right, well, I don't know, this is not based on anything other than a hypothetical situation, but if you would say, right, I'll give Ange Postecoglou the chance to work with, I don't know, Jadon Sancho, for instance, who would almost certainly be available. You'd think, yeah, I kind of want to see that, right? I want to see what he could do there. Or like if you had a really kind of fluid false number 9 style forward who could also produce 15 goals a season, yeah, I'd want to see Postecoglou. I want to see what he'd be able to make from that. So, yeah, absolutely. It's not a guarantee that things are going to go well, but it's not a Conte situation where what you're really dealing with is either you spend a lot of money or there's no progress, because that's what that situation was like. I think there's a fluidity in a really encouraging way about it. And I wouldn't be able to understand anything, to the contrary.
Okay. Brilliant. Let's end it there. Seb, Jack, thanks very much for your time. And also thank you all for listening. We are definitely back tomorrow for more.